laws describe what's happening, but laws don't make anything. Laws don't create anything. They just describe what happens. You've still got to explain why they happen. Classical metaphysicians don't care how old the universe is. They don't care if it was always here, because the question of the existence of the universe isn't how did it come into being. The question, even as Stephen Hawking recognizes, is why does it exist now? Sometimes it's said that Thomistic or Aristotelian philosophy is simply sophisticated common sense. I have no difficulty with that. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What we're going to talk about tonight is just a broad summary comparison of atheistic materialism and theistic hylomorphism. Big word, but what we're talking about is the Aristotelian Thomistic notion of matter and form explaining the universe. But at any rate, that's secondary. What I'm going to do at the outset is try to present the position of the atheistic materialist. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's too easy just to present one's view and not fully understand the opposition. If you really want to respond to atheistic materialism, you had better give it an honest presentation. And that's what I'm going to try to do here, to the best of my ability. The worldview from that of the atheistic materialist, first of all, is one that is very closely tied to natural science. And certainly those who call themselves atheistic materialists or scientific materialists are quite convinced that natural science provides all the truth that there is that's worth having in this world. So let's take a look at the way that they look at the world. First of all, we live in a cosmos which they, as well as most other people, would allow was the result of the so-called Big Bang, which took place, according to standard measurements, 13.8 billion years ago. It seems to be that was a beginning in time, because even Stephen Hawking, I was reading a paper by him, although I couldn't find the date on it, did allow that the second law of thermodynamics really indicates that there had to be a beginning in time. Because according to that principle, which is one of the most basic principles of physics, disorder increases with time. So that if the universe went backwards in time infinitely, by now there would be no order left at all, and we'd be just reduced to the level of protoprotons doing nothing, at near absolute zero. Since we're not, the universe, by most standard physics, would have to allow to have had a beginning in time. Now, you'll often see arguments, especially between evolutionary materialists and young earth creationists, about whether the world had a beginning. And the materialists, for the longest time maintained that there wasn't a beginning. It was just a steady state theory. It was here forever. And that's because they attest to what everybody should know by natural reason, and that is that if at any one time there was absolutely nothing in existence, there'd be nothing now. So it's a bit of an embarrassment, and they resisted for a long time the notion that of the Big Bang, that there was any beginning at all. And as a matter of fact, as you may know, some of the writings of some of the materialists like Stephen Hawking try to argue that even before the beginning of the Big Bang, that this was simply a little cosmic bubble coming off a previous Big Bang. And they suggest, and I'm going to present it from their perspective, that this goes back to infinity, so that you have, as it were, endless Big Bangs. They insist, of course, that this is not created by God, that the universe is simply a brute given fact. If you ask, why does anything exist at all? The answer they would basically give you is, it exists because it's a given that it does exist. And there is no reason why it should have to exist any more than that your God exists. If one is given as a brute fact, why not the other? And besides that, you can get something from nothing. As Hawking and others have suggested, you can get it using quantum mechanics from the basic quantum flux, where down at the very acute subatomic level, you actually have little bits of material entities popping into existence and then popping out of existence with no causality involved whatever. If you ask, why does anything exist at all? Many of the modern atheists will simply say that the universe has what they call aseity. Aseity meaning it exists of itself. It doesn't need a further explanation. I'm thinking of people like Roy Wood Sellers or Kai Nielsen or John Hospers and of course Hawking that insist that the universe is simply a given and it's not reasonable to ask why it is there. It doesn't need a further explanation. Now, to understand how they can say this, you have to realize that they would say what others, like the Aristotelian Thomistic philosophers, would say, well, there are metaphysical first principles, such as that effects have causes, and there have to be reasons for things. They would say, on the other hand, those principles are not universal. They are not transcendental. The causality that we experience in the world around us holds good for the world around us. But if you go down to the really sub-microscopic level, it doesn't have to be. Because at the sub-microscopic level, we actually find conflicts in the principle of non-contradiction. Standard metaphysicians say a thing has to be or not be, and can't have anything in between. But we have subatomic experiments which demonstrate that a photon can be at one time a photon, and another time it would be viewed as a wave. And I say at one and another time, I should be more precise, at the same time, just depending on how you look at it. So I've had physicists argue with me that, in fact, the principle of non-contradiction at the subatomic level doesn't apply. In other words, it's not a truly universal principle, and that's why when you come to explaining the entire universe, why does it have to apply there? We have simply assumed that it applies. They will admit that based on stochastics and probability, at the macroscopic level that you and I exist in, we will never see a violation of causality. But at the same time, that's because the statistics, as you might say, round everything off so that it works the way you would expect it to work. But at the theoretical level, when you're dealing with the principle of indeterminacy and you're dealing with the Copenhagen interpretation of what's taking place at the subatomic level, these rules are not absolute. Things are contingent, chance, fluctuating, uncertain. And if they are uncertain at that level, in principle, they could be uncertain even at the supramacroscopic level of the entire universe. So they would insist that the best evidence we have about the world comes from natural science, but you can't use the reasoning about causality in this world to argue to some kind of a transcendent world for which we have no evidence whatever. Chance and indeterminacy exist at the quantum level. It's where violation, like they say, it's curiouser than you could possibly imagine. And therefore, the common sense philosophies of the world around us simply betray us at that level. You can't really trust them to assist us. Now, beyond that, if you probably have heard about the Anthropic Principle, which points out that the laws of this universe are so perfectly adjusted that, for example, if the Big Bang had expanded 1/100,000th of a millionth times faster than it did, it would have just dissipated and the stars and suns and the planets would never even been formed. Or if it had been any slower in its rate of expansion, it never would have expanded, it would have collapsed in on itself. So to get the world that we're in, not only that rate of expansion had to be perfect, but a dozen other major constants had to be just so to get this world. And that's why many argue that that is evidence for some kind of intelligent design. Well, the problem from from the standpoint of the materialist, is that it's possible that what we have is multiple universes, and that what happens because of the principle of indeterminacy is like Schrodinger's cat. It's either alive or dead, but you don't know until it comes out. When you open the box, it's either alive or dead. But while it's in there, you don't know which way it's going to be. The universe is like that. It branches. Every time an event takes place, at the submicroscopic level, we can't be sure what's going to happen. So it's one theory for multiverses is that the one universe goes one way and another one goes another way. So you're in one universe, and your doppelganger's in another universe taking a different course of action. Anybody who's seen the Star Trek series has seen episodes based on this kind of theory. Well, as a matter of fact, the idea of multiple universes extends to probably at least 10 or 12 different theories of multiple universes. So we're not going to go through those tonight. But the argument that is being made is this: because there are potentially infinite numbers of multiple universes, what we take to be the order and design and the fixed constants that are perfect for life and intelligent life in this universe just happens to be because we are in one of those universes that turned out right. There could be a nearly infinite number that turned out unsuitable for life, unsuitable for anything. But a few of them, like if you had 1,000,000 marbles in a bag and there were 5 blue marbles, if you shook it up enough times, the 5 blue marbles would come out next to each other. And that's what we're in. We just happen to be in one that looks intelligible and intelligent to us because that's the one we happen to be in. And if it weren't this kind of a universe, we wouldn't be here to know it, would we? So it doesn't really prove an intelligent designer. It just raises the possibility that we just got lucky. Pure chance, in other words, begets this cosmos. Nevertheless, it begets a cosmos in which the chemistry tends to beget conditions that give rise to life. And even though it seems, amazing that it would be such, remember, there's a countless number of other universes where it didn't happen, where it didn't work out. We're in one where it did. And because it did, life arose from the basic building blocks. The first stars were made of hydrogen. They convert to helium. Heavy metals are formed therefrom. From the second generation of stars then begin to produce planets that include heavy types of planets such as Earth, and with carbon and molybdenum and lead and strontium and nickel and all the other elements that are necessary as building blocks of life. You get that primordial soup, and out of it suddenly, given enough time, enough chance, plus the entropy that's within the chemical elements in this universe, not everyone, it gives rise to life. And thus, once you have self-replicating biochemistry, and we have today experiments that indicate at a very primitive level that with some amino acids and so forth, we can get self-replicating chemistry, but given enough time, we'll do it all the way. I mean, this is the argument that we are developing here. So the rules of this cosmos are such that they tend to give rise to life. When you begin to get living things, what you really have are simply associations of basic subatomic and atomic particles, entities, elements, compounds. If you stop and think about it, it isn't that they really give rise to, say, living organisms that are what we would call a unity, a unity of a thing. Because that's where the Aristotelians say, well, they've got to have forms. You got to have a form for a mushroom, and a form for a horse, and a form for a man. But you see, there really aren't any such forms. What you have is simply the pure chance production of biochemical unities, soups that are capable of nutrition, growth, and reproduction, entities that are bound together by certain accidental forces but enable them to work under the guidance of DNA, which again is spontaneously formed. This DNA then guides the way that they are able to operate in such a way that we take them to be a single living organism. But in truth, they are simply a highly complex set of organic compounds interacting according to an algorithm that was developed through 3.8 billion years of evolution on this earth. And what looks as though it's designed and directed so as to give unity to these living things, in fact, is simply the result of pure chance interactions of the chemicals that are involved. And you can move this I don't even want to say all the way up through life forms, because, life forms are not better than one another. This idea of, getting more and more perfect life forms, that's a misunderstanding. The truth of the matter is that based on survival of the fittest, a moss is a wonderful life form. And the fact that it hasn't undergone all the changes that we see in the world around us for millions and billions of years is only an indication of what great survival value it already attained. As for the plants and the animals which give rise to more and more complex forms, you have to remember they just happen to branch off into certain forms that had enough survival value to stay around to the present time. Some of them did go extinct, like 65 million years ago when that asteroid wiped out all the dinosaurs. But what I'm trying to get across here is it isn't that one life form is superior to another, they're simply different. They're just different. And some of them, yes, develop capabilities like sensation. But you have to remember, that isn't because this is a new and qualitatively superior perfection. This is because it was built into the chemistry of the compounds that made them up. You don't get the quality manifested until a compound is formed. To put it in very simple terms, look at sodium and chlorine. You can't eat sodium and chlorine. They're deadly poisons. But if you combine them, they suddenly manifest this wonderful capability of being able to be put on your hamburger and it tastes better. Now, it isn't because we've added anything to the world, it's just that what was already implicitly within the sodium and within the chlorine is now manifested when they happen to be operating together. So that's how you have to look at all the changes that occur through evolution, through billions of years. The things that you think are new and better and more perfect really aren't. They are simply the manifestation of qualities that were implicit in the basic subatomic entities from the beginning and just get manifested because of the way they happen to mix together. So obviously what I'm attacking is some of the theistic notions that somehow God has ordained and designed this world and put into it more and more perfect things, ultimately leading to man. No, not at all. This is just a matter of what's implicit in the basic biochemistry from the very beginning and doesn't involve anything that's really new. It's just what was assumed or what was already entailed as properties waiting to be manifested when certain compounds got together in the right way. So what takes place is we have a gradual emergence by randomness and chance and natural selection. Even, now some people say, well, you materialists, you're looking at this from, like you're dealing just with a bunch of marbles or BBs or something. No, many materialists would say, we even allow that there are immaterial things. The Marxists do this. They sure didn't believe in God, and they surely were thoroughgoing materialists, but they allow that there are immaterial things. They allow that, for example, an image, you won't find it inside a brain. If you're thinking about or imagining a brilliant Christmas tree. You won't find a little Christmas tree in your head. But we know that given the correct neuronal patterns within the brain, this kind of an experience takes place. So we allow that there may be non-material things formed, but they are ultimately dependent upon matter, and therefore you still didn't get beyond matter. You're still living in a materialist universe. And I realize, for example, that we do have the classical arguments like we find in Plato for man having a spiritual soul, because we go beyond merely what's dependent on matter. We're able to know the universal essences of beauty and truth and justice and all this sort of thing. We're able to form the understanding of the essences of all sorts of things that could not possibly depend on matter. Well, we have an answer to that one too, and it's called nominalism. What you take to be universal words are simply individual words that describe a group of things that happen to be similar to each other. And it's really the word standing as a symbol for those individual things. And if you know the literature, you realize it's hotly contested as to whether this can be explained by what I call the Nominalist Thesis. But basically that would be the explanation. It's just like a sheep knows a wolf and the wolf knows a sheep, not because they have some abstract notion of wolfiness or sheepiness, but because they have a common image that they have formed that is like other images that they get from different individual wolves. So the sheep learns to react from prior experience in a consistent way, running away whenever it runs into something that is similar to that common image. And the wolf conversely tries to eat the sheep for the same reason. So in essence, in other words, what you take to be cerebral or actually spiritual activities on the part of man that distinguishes him and makes him superior to animals is simply a highly evolved form of sensation. And sensation is reducible to neuronic activity in the brain, even though some of its epiphenomena are not themselves extended in space. And what you take to be the spiritual part of this really just doesn't get beyond that point. Clearly, in this worldview, we have, and we're able to explain everything. There's no universal essences, for example. You know, this whole idea that there are species and these universal essences can be used to explain all things, that's also misleading, because there really aren't any species. We know from evolution that all you have is individuals that are constantly changing. Even with the kind of saltistic evolution that Eldridge and I forget the other fellow's name, hold today, that is kind of a sudden change, but even within that sudden change, it takes place gradually over a period of a few hundred years. But the point is, there is no such thing as just a cat. What a cat is just a name for a mid-range of similar furry, clawy creatures that we cast into biological species for purposes of discussing and handling them for veterinary medicine. So you don't really have the universals that the Platonists and the spiritualistic philosophers use as the basis for their claims for man having a special spiritual soul. In other words, or again, you talk about human freedom. We can explain that by the principle of indeterminacy. At the subatomic level, ultimately, the subatomic events are not predictable. They are not strictly causal. There is no way ever to determine them. And therefore, maybe what you call free will is just that. And if it isn't, then you really don't have free will, and you still have a deterministic universe, and you don't need a God for that. So I think that's a fair representation of the position that would be held by scientific materialists. This is only a summary position, obviously. Later on in our courses, we'll go through this in a greater detail. from a number of points of view. But it's really important, if you're going to respond to or attack a position, try to get it as right as you can. Try to be as honest as you can in letting them present what they're saying, because we're not dealing with people that are unintelligent by any means. Now, to switch my venue here, from the standpoint of what I would call theistic hylomorphism, which is a radically diverse philosophy from materialism. But probably the first thing I have to say is you should notice that materialism isn't natural science. Natural science is a discipline, which is a wonderful discipline, that anybody can study and learn about the physical world, chemistry, biology, physics, and so forth. When you insist that it tells you nothing exists but material entities, you have stepped over into philosophy. Because it's one thing to say I'm observing material things, and it's another thing to say nothing can be that is not material. That's a metaphysical judgment. In fact, there's such a thing as the metaphysics of materialism. So if one objects that what the Aristotelian Thomists are doing is philosophy as opposed to science, no, let's get it right. What we are doing is philosophy as opposed to a materialist philosophy. And natural science has the blessing of both sides. The position of the classical Aristotelian is not opposed to natural science in any way, shape, or manner, but it is a matter of embracing it rationally. First of all, let's go back to those metaphysical principles that I was talking about, that the natural scientists today, or the scientific materialists, say you can't trust universally. First of all, we don't know them from having studied subatomic events. We know them from our experience of the world. And we form the concept of being the first time we run into anything. And it is immediately given to anybody who is intellectually honest that they know that a thing either is or isn't, and there's nothing in between. The argument that you can prove at the subatomic level that the principle of non-contradiction, which means that being cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. The argument that says you can prove that doesn't hold is based on making subatomic observations. You're observing a photon appear as a particle here. You're seeing a photon appear there as a wave. And you're taking a measurement, you're saying it was a particle here, and it was not a particle there, therefore they contradict each other. But the problem is, if you don't presuppose the principle of non-contradiction, you couldn't know that it is a particle and not a non-particle here, and that it is a wave and not a non-wave there. In other words, you're using, and you must use, the principle of non-contradiction at the subatomic level to make these judgments. Every statement that you make in any scientific venue is presupposing the principle of non-contradiction, and everything that goes with it, these metaphysical first principles of reason and causality, because if you didn't know them, you couldn't say them. How could you say that salt is made out of sodium chloride? Are you kidding me? Are you telling me it also isn't made out of it? See, you've made an assertion, and in affirming that as true, you've denied the contradictory. Every scientific statement is an expression of a presupposition of the principle of non-contradiction. And every scientific investigation looks for reasons, looks for causes. One of the reasons that the modern-day scientific materialist has a problem with causality is he doesn't know what the classical definition of causality was. He's borrowed it from David Hume and others who think that causality means a kind of predictability, that given one event, you can predict another event. And that's not what metaphysicians say. What they say is, given an effect, given something that doesn't fully explain itself, something else has to explain it. And that includes the universe as a whole. Otherwise, you can abandon all reason, and therefore, what always amuses me is the people who run around, the positivists who keep saying, we're the only rational people because we follow reason, we follow good scientific reasoning, and then when they come to explain what's the reason for the whole universe, they say, we don't know, there's no reason, we don't need a reason. Then the ultimate application, they become irrational. More than that, even so-called quantum fluctuations at the subatomic level are not pure nothingness. They're not, because you're presuming the quantum flux. You're presuming the quantum mechanics apply. You're presuming a set of rules in the universe. You're not dealing with absolutely nothing. And the fact that you see something pop into appearance out of a vacuum and then disappear doesn't mean a violation of metaphysical first principles. It just means you don't know what's going on. You haven't made a good observation of the nothing. Because if the nothing were absolutely nothing, you'd have nothing. I mean, stop and think about it for a minute. Why is it the Big Bang always presupposes there's something before it? They've got to presuppose that there's something before it because they know, as well as anybody else, if you ever absolutely had nothing, end of the story. You're never going to get anything. From non-being, you don't get being, ever. And as far as this notion that Hawking suggests where maybe you could get the universe bubbling out of a prior cosmos that's in an inflationary expansion, and that's coming out of another one, that's out of another one, there was at least one scientific paper which argues that that's quite impossible. If you constantly get inflationary, in an inflationary universe, there has to be a point at which it didn't exist prior. But don't get too upset about that. That's natural science. We don't prove God's existence by natural science. If you do, you're not doing metaphysics. You're not doing philosophy. There are other ways to do it. Not that I've got the time to do them all tonight, but we'll keep looking here. Oh yes, what about the multiple universes? Whatever you want to say about it, they presume that there are universal physical rules. If they didn't, it would be pure Alice in Wonderland. You couldn't set up a theory of everything. And in fact, these theories of everything have been criticized precisely for that reason, because ultimately they're unfalsifiable. They are mythological. They are as much a matter of faith as they accuse theologians of having. You can't disprove them because you can't prove them or disprove them. And even on the hypothesis that, let's say there was a God who made infinite multiple universes, so what? If he's really infinite, he certainly could do that. What matters is the one that we're in has sense and order and purpose, and that's what we're examining. But we don't need to get tied up with that, because remember, this isn't a matter of doing physics. It's a matter, for the philosopher, of doing metaphysics, and the scientific materialist does not know what metaphysics is. Or at least he certainly doesn't want to have any part of it. One further thing, the English mathematician John Lennox makes a good point, and that is all these laws that the physicists refer to as somehow governing subatomic behavior in quantum mechanics, or even in some kind of a general theory of everything in multiple universes, these laws explain nothing. As Lennox says so insightfully, laws describe what's happening, but laws don't make anything. Laws don't create anything. They just describe what happens. You've still got to explain why they happen, why they are created. Moreover, there really is no such thing as pure chance or pure spontaneity. Pure spontaneity means something happens and there's absolutely no reason for it at all. And that comes back again to those metaphysical first principles. If you think things can happen and there's no reason for it, hang up your credentials as a natural scientist, because you're out of business. You know, quit looking for reasons. There aren't any reasons. You're living in an irrational universe. That isn't how the scientist operates. He's always looking for reasons. Now, let's get back to a very basic point. Remember, we were talking about how by some process of evolution, First of all, it is an evolution, but some process of interaction of subatomic and atomic units. You get a primeval soup, and then you somehow get life out of this. And I'm not going to even go to the point that we just haven't done it yet. But you know, that's a scientific observation. But from the standpoint of philosophy, how do we know that there's really no essences or forms above the atomic level? I mean, that's really what much of what we're discussing tonight is about. How do we know that everything just reduces to the atomic level? If it does, stop and think about it for a minute. What that means is the only things that are real are those subatomic entities. I won't go into what they are because the physicists themselves don't know what they are. They broke them down to compounds and elements, and the elements broke down to subatomic particles, and those into quarks, and you know, we keep going. The quarks are held together with gluon. But as you start building these units together, if they don't constitute real things moving up, if you don't get a mushroom or a frog or a horse or a tree or a human being that is really one substantial thing, if it's all just a bunch of the individual parts, then there really isn't anything seriously above that subatomic level. There are no things. What do you mean by a thing? It just isn't there. Philosophers call it a substance. But there are no things except the subatomic units that are built together, accidentally, shaking hands to manifest new properties. That doesn't make them one thing. The embarrassing result of that, if you carry it to its logical conclusion, is that the philosophy of evolution and atheistic materialism exists as propounded by Richard Dawkins. But unfortunately, Richard Dawkins doesn't exist. Because think about it, according to his own philosophy, he's nothing but a tremendous pile, trillions and trillions of ultimately elements or subatomic particles piled together. Because you got to ask, what does it mean to say that Richard Dawkins has a human nature? That he's a human being? To say that you have a human nature and that human beings share a given nature means that every part of you is human. Isn't that what it means to be human? If you're human, the whole of you is human, down to the last cell. Now, if it turns out, in fact, that every part of you, down to the subatomic or atomic parts, are still what they were when they weren't in you. In other words, every sodium ion, every chlorine ion, strontium, molybdenum, lead, argon, neon, sulfur, carbon, every single atom that was in the universe that somehow has come out of some star and has now become part of your living body is still what it was originally. It hasn't undergone what metaphysicians call a substantial change. So you aren't Richard Dawkins, you are just carbon and neon and sulfur and oxygen and all these individual atoms still. You can spout a philosophy that says scientific materialism, but there aren't any scientific materialists to pronounce it. Everything really reduces down to that level. That's why I think they find it kind of embarrassing to talk that way. Nobody wants to stand up there and say, you know, I'm not really here. and surely, I'm serious, they don't want to talk that way. They don't talk about that part of it. They don't talk about the logic of where they're going. That's what it would mean. If you take the opposite position and admit, yes, Richard Dawkins does exist, and so do 6 billion other people, and so do all the mushrooms and the toadstools and the horses and cows and lions. They all really exist, and they really are one being, because that's what it means for them to exist, and they have a nature. You've got a different world. You've got a world in which there's got to be a principle of unity making them one thing. And if there's something that makes them one thing, hey, that's what Aristotle called a form. That's what he called a form. something that explains the nature of the thing above the atomic level. But you know, the moment you say that, you're no longer a materialist. You're no longer an atomist. You have entered the world of that ancient archaic philosopher Aristotle, who insisted that matter comes under what we call forms, and that different forms specify things into species, and from those species you can abstract universals which are truly in the mind and make you different from the worms. It's a completely different way of looking at the universe. So which way are we going to do it? Are we going to have hylomorphic Aristotelianism, or do we simply eradicate all the scientific materialists? I'm tempted sometimes to do the latter. But logic tells me no, they're just wrong. I believe they exist, and I believe they exist as human beings. And that means, really, that there are natures, forms in things that make them to be one thing. And by the way, this is what Aristotle calls the substantial form, as it's the form of a thing, the form of a substance. What makes a horse, and a tree, and a cow, and a cow, and a laboratory assistant, a laboratory assistant. Because you got to realize, we started out in a world in which people existed. Before we had science, we had people who studied science. And those people are still around. And it seems passing strange to develop a theory coming from your study of science, which ultimately leads you to no longer believe in the people that started investigating it. If there is what is called substantial form, that means there's something in things above the atomic level which makes them to be one thing of a certain type. A horse, a cow, whatever you call them. You don't have to get into a big fight about how do you determine what they are to be and what species. That's not at issue right now. The point is there something that makes them one and makes them the kind of thing that they are? You don't have to call it a form. Call it a thingy. Call it anything you want. X. Doesn't matter. But there's some real principle, some reality in them that makes them different than just a pile of atoms. Aristotle calls it substantial form. What does substantial form do according to Aristotle's metaphysics and physics? He says, first of all, it makes a thing one. It gives it unity. It makes it a substantially one being. So you're not a whole pile of things. There are things in our bodies that don't belong to us. We'd be glad to get rid of it, like our stomach acid or the urine in our bladder. But if you say every part of you doesn't belong to you, eventually there's no you. So there's got to be some things in us where the least parts of us are truly sharing in our human nature, or, by reduction to absurdity, we don't exist. So anytime you start going down the track of saying, well, maybe this isn't me or that isn't me, be careful. Just keep following. You're going to wind up with there being no you, and no horses and no trees. And you talk about common sense. The scientific materialist says he conforms to common sense, but he can't even justify the existence of a cow. That doesn't sound like common sense to me. The second thing that a form does is it determines the thing's nature. It puts it into a species. In other words, it makes it to belong to the class of things we call horses, or cows, or trees, or whatever they are. And I'm not going to get into the theory of what constitutes a species. That's another long topic which we deal with in other classes. But at least this is a foundation for the Platonic insistence that there are species of things and that the mind can know them, and in knowing them, it's knowing something non-material. One other thing that the form does, it gives existence to a substance as being this thing. It makes you to be this particular human being, or horse, or toadstool, or whatever you happen to be. And finally, and this is one that's a little more difficult to follow, but it's important, that form actively determines the matter that makes you up as to its specificity. That form puts the matter into the species of being a horse, cow, tree, or whatever it happens to be. So in a very real sense, you have to make a basic judgment here between materialism and this classical Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy. Do you believe in the reality of things in this world, or do you think the world just reduces to nothing but subatomic entities and we're just a living illusion, a self-delusion that we're here but we're really not? We're just an accidental temporary unity of a bunch of biochemical entities. We're not really here. How do we know that we are one thing? Do we have any evidence? I mean, common sense tells us this. Sometimes it's said that Thomistic or Aristotelian philosophy is simply sophisticated common sense. I have no difficulty with that. If you told me it was common nonsense, I'd have difficulty. But if you tell me it conforms to common sense, that's not an embarrassment. If you have a philosophy that tells you that you're nothing but a pile of subatomic particles, then I think you have a problem with common sense. But how do we know that we are one being? The classical arguments run something like this. You know the nature of anything by observing its activity. and by the way, did you ever notice things are not completely individualized? We are able to classify things. The evolutionist claims that everything's gradually evolving so there aren't any real species. Okay, let him say that. But what about the rest of science? What happens to chemistry? Do you think sodium is slowly evolving into chlorine? Do you think strontium is slowly degrading into lead? I mean, we do get some radioactive decay, but that's according to specific rules. The whole point of natural science is for the ability of the human mind to penetrate the nature of the universe and to discover its rules, its laws, the way that it works, and to classify and distinguish everything in the universe. Forget about the biological entities that you think are just squishing one into another. Doesn't matter. The rest of your science, your astronomy, your chemistry, your physics, all of these things presuppose that the world can be classified according to specific categories such that you can mathematically define them with precision, compare them, experiment upon them, come up with theories, hypotheses, produce results, verify them. All of that means classifications within the mind, universal concepts. So don't get hung up on the fact that the claim that there are no species in the biological world. Even if there weren't, the universe gives rise to species, classifications of things, and that means that the mind is able to know things in a general, universal, unchanging way. Sodium will always be sodium. It could ultimately degrade into its subatomic particles so that it no longer exists above absolute zero. But that wouldn't be sodium anymore. That would be what's left of what once was sodium. But sodium as a concept is a universal, unchanging entity. Anyway, coming back to how do we know we're one being? You tell the nature of something by its activity. In living things, all the parts act for the good of the whole. They all act together as one. Your foot doesn't sit there and say, I'm just going to go walking around by myself for my own fun. No, it is subordinated to your direction. The stomach gives all that it's got for you, even when you eat things that should destroy it. It still does its very best to keep you alive. An alcoholic tries to destroy his liver. His liver does all in its power to keep him alive. The organism as a whole keeps its parts alive so that the parts can work together to keep the organism alive. That's common sense. Now you can try to reduce this to a biochemical algorithm. Good luck. I grant that's the other side of the argument, but look at what you take your pick as to which way you're going here. Probably the best evidence is what we call the intrinsic finality that you find within embryonic life with bisexual reproduction you have the formation of an embryo. In that embryo, all the parts of that first living cell are operating with each other to keep the cell alive. That all the parts act for the good of the whole, and the whole keeps the parts integral for its own sake. Now, if this sounds like teleology, so be it. It's factual teleology because that's how the things act. But beyond that, that embryo has within it a tendency to grow up, to multiply, and to multiply under the guidance. I know, we say, well, it's the DNA that does it. So be it. But that DNA is operating within the whole of the embryo. And watch what happens. Every stage of development is governed by the whole, so that all the parts act together so as to produce the whole adult. And at every stage of development, every part of the organism, if it's a human being, as a child, as a teen, as a young adult, as an older adult, every part at every stage is still operating for the good of the whole, and as long as it's maturing, for the good of the adult whole. Now that's not surprising. I know, sure, biologically people will say, of course they do that. I just want you to notice the fact, though, that all the parts are acting for the good of the whole, not for themselves. That's not what you would expect to see of an individual subatomic particle. Where do you get any tendency within a subatomic particle to act for the good of an entire organism? I know they'll say, well, over 3.8 billion years, by pure chance, it's gotten to the point where it does that. It developed its own algorithm. Okay, if you want to believe that, fine. But these are your stark alternatives. The other evidence that we have, of course, is the evidence that we're here ourselves. We experience our own unity. As Descartes says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Not a pile of atoms, I am. I am the one who is experiencing all of the things that my 5 external senses give me of the room in which I'm standing. I see your colors, your shapes, your sounds. All these things come at me, and I receive them as a unified whole. And I can respond. If somebody's attacking me, I respond and marshal all the parts of my whole being to defend myself, to preserve my existence, and I'm aware of commanding the parts of my being to this end of self-preservation. That's why we have an instinctive awareness of our own existence. In addition to Descartes' proper observation that we reflect upon our own consciousness and notice that we're here. We don't think of ourselves as being but an accidental, temporary epiphenomenon of a biochemical soup. We think we are real, and that the entities that we classify as these subatomic particles serve our purpose. Hylomorphism means that there are parts in you. They may be something that was called chlorine when it was outside of you, but when it's really part of your being, it shares in human nature. What part of you is it? It's the part that's going to be chlorine once you excrete it. But temporarily, it shares in the wholeness of your being. We are one whole being. We experience the world as a whole. What physical things do that as a whole? You can have a tape recorder or a TV set. Look, just think of the example of a TV set. Hundreds of thousands of little pixels depict one image. But no pixel sees the entire image. But you do. A dog bounding into the room looks at the TV set, it sees the whole picture. It sees a dog on the picture. It doesn't see 625,000 pixels. So the fact that we are able to unify our experience in one simple act, subjectively experienced, that is a sign and evidence that we are one being, that we experience as one. Now, remember I told you earlier that some materialists say, well, there are non-material aspects. And what I was just describing, that unity of experience, that's a non-material aspect that even a dog has. Doesn't prove a spiritual soul. There are other evidences There are other arguments that can be given that belong to classical philosophical psychology, classical metaphysics, wherein we are able to demonstrate rationally the spirituality of the soul. What do you have to do that? You have to show not only that there are things that we do or that we have within us that are not extended in space, but they don't even depend on what's extended in space. One quick example, and it's only one example, is the universal concept. David Hume talks about images. He talks about mental impressions. He says that you have mental impressions, and some of them are images, which are very clear and distinct mental impressions. But then he says you've got ideas. Ideas are like little reflections. They're just little mirror images, as it were, of these original images that are bold and strong. He doesn't know the difference between an image and a concept. I'll tell you what the difference is, very simply put. Imagine for yourself a triangle. Can you do that? You bet you can. What color is it, by the way? And what shape is it? I'm willing to bet most all of you just imagined an equilateral triangle. But your understanding of triangularity isn't something you can imagine. Imagine triangularity. Imagine triangularity. Let me see you do it. How do you do it? Triangularity, by definition, covers every three-sided plane figure. And there's an infinite number of them. Some of them are laying on their backs, some are leaning forward, some are straight up and down, some are isosceles, some are equilateral. You can't imagine them all, but you can understand them all. And the difference is that the image, we say, is under the conditions of matter. It is extended, as it were, in space with color and shape. You can imagine it. You could make one. You could make a statue of one. You could make a painting of a blue triangle. But you can't make a painting or a statue of triangularity because it's not under the conditions of matter. That's an indication that there are things that we know, things that we can do that don't depend on matter. They're not only non-material, they're strictly non-material, they're what we call spiritual, and they are the kind of thing that we use as evidence in philosophical psychology for the spirituality and ultimately the immortality of the human soul. And what about coming back to God? You know, a big fight about how old is the universe, did it have a beginning? I have news for you. Classical metaphysicians don't care how old the universe is. They don't care if it was always here, because the question of the existence of the universe isn't how did it come into being. The question, even as Stephen Hawking recognizes, is why does it exist now? And you can't get away with just saying, well, it's just a brute fact with no reason for it. That's intellectual suicide. What metaphysicians do is they examine the conditions of the universe, and instead of saying it's a brute fact that explains itself, they notice that the physical universe doesn't explain itself. All the classical proofs for God's existence rest on the fact that the universe is incapable of explaining itself. It doesn't, I realize you've heard the argument many times where people say, well, the universe just explains itself. Why does it need an explanation? You say God just explains himself, so if he explains himself, why can't the universe? The whole point is, when you study the universe, you notice it's a finite set of things. And it turns out, when you examine them carefully enough, that a finite set of things can't explain itself. Finite beings don't explain themselves. An infinite being can, because it's its own reason for being. Contingent finite beings can't because they're not their own reason for being. That belongs properly to the science of metaphysics. A science which the scientific materialists, of course, don't even believe exists. I can assure you that the proofs for God's existence don't rest on going back in time and trying to find God at the beginning of time. I know because I wrote a book entitled Aquinas' Proofs for God's Existence, and I assure you his proofs don't go back in time. They look for an explanation of existence here and now. Why does anything exist now? The world of science, in fact, presumes that the mind can penetrate beyond sensible experiences to come to an understanding of things as they are in themselves. And that is a great assumption and a good assumption. a recognition that the human mind is able to go beyond merely what natural science observes. Natural science is wonderful for describing the nature of the physical universe around us, but it is not a philosophy in itself. It describes how things work, but it doesn't ultimately explain why they exist or why they have the natures they do. If you penetrate the nature of the universe and ask a physicist again, why does this phenomenon occur? He'll say, well, it's because of this. And then you ask, well, why is that? He'll say, it's because of that. And you ask him, why is that? And he'll keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. Eventually, he'll come down to a point where he'll say, well, that's just the way it is. Ultimately, if multiverses exist and if they exist the way that they claim they do, why the rules? Where'd the rules come from? Why are there rules to nature at all? And if there are no rules, why isn't nature pure chaos? It is a legitimate question to ask, why are there fundamental structures in the universe which serve as the foundation for the investigations of natural science? And it is a proper question to ask, why does anything exist at all? Again, these are properly philosophical questions that go beyond natural science, and since the scientific materialist doesn't want to go beyond natural science, he's not going to get there. Some of these questions are things that we investigate later on in some of our courses here at the Aquinas School of Philosophy. Obviously, we can't entertain them all tonight. Some of the questions that I've been dealing with pertaining to evolution, I treat in my book, Origin of the Human Species, 3rd edition, which just came out in 2014. We can't treat them all tonight. In subsequent classes, hopefully we'll do so, but I just wanted to give you something of a summary tonight about the difference between the way the atheist materialist looks at the universe and the way the classical Aristotelian Thomist philosopher looks at the universe. It is a radically different way of looking at it, and I would suggest that really we Thomists have common sense on our side. We live in a world which is the real world we experience, and we don't have to do away with it for a kind of Platonic mythology where only subatomic particles exist and the rest is just a chimera. And I do believe that you exist, and that's why I'm a Thomist. I do believe that Richard Dawkins exists, and I just wish he would join us in believing in his own existence. Until then, I thank you, and good night.